So I just read this book called The Midnight Taxi by Yosha Sunekara, if that's how it's pronounced. I guess she's Sri Lankan. And I'm going to say who she is, why I read it, and why I was a little bit disappointed. Uh, what did I say her name is? Yosha? I guess she used to work as a public defender in New York, and now she works at the Innocence Project doing intake, which basically means, I think, that, people send her their stories, people in prison say, hey, I'm innocent, I was convicted with no evidence, this, that, or the other thing went wrong at trial. And she reads through it and figures out which one of these cases that the Innocence Project lawyers have a good prospect of helping. And the reason I read it is because while the Innocence Project, has this goal towards, preventing, I guess, wrongful convictions, and however they think that is done, I consider myself a researcher in the field of state witness perjury, and I have a goal of improving courts so that they don't just produce garbage like they do. Like, my observation is that courts are just filled with lies and garbage. And so, my goal is sort of to just improve the product of courts, and their goal is to end wrongful convictions. And we have very different beliefs and philosophies about how that's done. And so I wanted to read this book because it said on the Innocence Project Twitter page that this was inspired by Yosha's work at the Innocence Project. And, the fact that she works at the Innocence Project, I know that she's going to have some kind of an agenda in this book. She's going to want to, slip in, try to convince the reader, hook the reader in with this interesting book, and then feed them all kinds of propaganda about how people are innocent and the system's not fair, yada, yada, yada. And, it's very important to do that. I myself made a little creepypasta video, Jack and Diane, trying to get across some concepts that I think are interesting about wrongful convictions. And everyone's provincial. Everyone has a different life experience. And I wanted to know if some of the sort of the philosophical disagreements that I have with the approach of people at the Innocence Project, how those might come out from how their perspective, the angle or the vantage point from which they see their work. And one of the things I always thought about that is they see these cases years after the trial. So they're not a part of the trial, they're not a part of the initial investigation, they're not a first-hand witness of the facts, they don't get to see cops lying and witnesses being coached and all that at the trial. But it turns out that this author was actually a New York City public defender before she was, just a paper nerd at the Innocence Project. So she has been in the heart of, cops lying. And, of course, her angle is just seeing people who can't make, a couple $100 bond being stuck at Rikers Island and things not being investigated and nobody cares and just broke poor people, having no help whatsoever. And that was kind of her angle. But I was a little disappointed in that the book it lacked messages of the exact nature of the criminal justice system and what's wrong with it. Like, there's that book by John Grisham. I can't remember the name of it, but he goes through all these wrongful convictions, and I haven't read the whole thing. I don't even remember how much I read, but he kind of goes more into the kind of the nature, the social phenomenon of wrongful convictions. And Yosha's book was more, it was almost misleading in my opinion, because it was a case that was based on evidence. She portrays in the book basically a murder mystery, and then they go through the evidence like nerds, almost like a CSI TV show, and find out, who really did it. And it was, it was acceptable as like a junk novel. Like, I used to ride the Amtrak train sometimes, and people would leave novels in the seat back, and I'd get there and there'd be a trash novel there, and I'd read it. and it'd be kind of a fast-paced, junky little mystery, just like a little bit more than potato chips, but not quite steak, just like maybe like a ham sandwich to read. And it started out a little bit kind of immature, and the lead character in the book was 28. And I was like, this book kind of does show like the kind of the immaturity and the provincial nature of the author. Like I don't really read like who's that guy who lived down in the Keys? I mean, there's like, you got authors like John Steinbeck. Who is that? That guy who, some famous author who lived down in the Florida Keys or something. But these authors are supposed to not be provincial, but have traveled the world and experienced human experience, so that they can kind of give like a seasoned perspective or insight, just some kind of thing like that. And this book is written by someone who gave kind of a sort of a provincial take, almost from a single girl living in Manhattan. But that, it took a couple pages to get over that. And then, going through it, it was basically, like a decent, like, first-person junk novel. But now to the critique of, I think that this Yosha Gunasekera, I can't remember her name. I think, her goal is to have, improving the court system messages in her book. And I think it fell short of that in a lot of ways, because it portrayed someone when it's first person. The book was first person of a person who was wrongfully accused. And right off, I mean, that portrays it wrong, because the kind of people who are wrongfully convicted are not the kind of people who can write a book and, remember things and investigate like the main character did. So, to be realistic, it's got to be a person who's just helpless and clueless, in addition to being broke. The main characteristic of this person was broke, but it turned out she had a rich best friend. A lot of people don't have any family whatsoever like this person had. And then they went through all this evidence, and they eventually figured out who really did the crime. In real life, the evidence doesn't matter. It's a social phenomenon. Like, there's a case in Australia that was, they made a documentary out of it. Like, they convicted some retarded kids for murder or something, and then when they found out it was actually a serial killer who did it, not these, like, retards that they'd given life in prison, the police didn't want to lock up. They didn't want to admit that it was a serial killer, because that's going to cost them politically. That's going to create problems for them. So they suppressed that these murders were done by a serial killer, to instead just keep the retarded kids in prison and make it look like they'd done good work. And so all the sort of the nerdy, going through this book, going through the evidence in this book, like evidence matters, and like people are curious about the truth. In my observation, none of that matters in real life. The facts are basically like a school of fish. Like, one person says one thing, true or false, and then for safety, everybody else just repeats it. One, because that they find something that politically benefits all of them. Two, it costs a huge amount of money with all these cases, and nobody really knows anything. You're never going to actually find out what happened in cases, but you have safety in just repeating what the narrative is. So people go to narratives like schools of fish, and there's usually no evidence. And who's convicted and what the facts are is just which school of fish is the largest. And so that the facts that the largest school of fish believes end up being called the truth. And in my experience and my observation, wrongful convictions are a social phenomenon where not only are the facts not known, but they don't matter. And everything is just, it's all narratives and propaganda and agendas produced by social phenomena and politics. Whereas Yosha's book went around, looking for, bank accounts, and this guy was wearing the same watch as that guy, and she recognized a girl who was at the scene, and, this person was stealing money. In a lot of cases, there isn't all that stuff. There's just people being encouraged to lie about whoever they pick to lie about. There's no evidence at all in a lot of cases. And it's just a completely social phenomenon. I mean, you look at people like William Dillon, Jeffrey Abramowski, or maybe like Gary Bennett, and there's not really any evidence except for just fake junk that was cooked up based on social phenomena. And so, decent junk novel, whines on a little bit about how, poor people don't have any help. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't very realistic. The poor person in the book had a lot of help. So I think that, that Yosha's work of sending messages about what's wrong with the justice system is probably very important to her, and she's very happy to get a book published. But if sending messages about the criminal justice system, about what's really wrong with it, was important to her, I think it fell short, and instead spent hundreds of pages talking about restaurants and like neighborhoods in New York City.